Hello, everyone. It's my great pleasure to have today as our guest Professor Scott Churchill from the University of Dallas. Today we are going to talk about empathy, and we will see how it connects with bioethics and different fields of our life. The floor is all yours. Thank you so much, Scott, for being here today.
Okay, now I just need to know, what do I do to share screen? At the bottom I can share screen. Okay. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to try to share the screen for a while and maybe come back and forth a bit so that we can still have the living presence of a speaking subject. But I'm going to put this video up first, but I have to first share screen. Okay. And now you're probably, are you seeing my whole screen there? Yeah.
Yes.
I'm just trying to move this thing over. It doesn't seem to want to, oh, there we go. So if I do slideshow from the start, there we go. And then I see in the corner here. All right, I can still see you. Okay. A participant has enabled closed captioning. Okay. All right, so I gave this little talk. The title that I used in a book chapter that Susie invited me to participate in for her book on empathy and ethics. And it's a long title: Empathy, Embodiment, and the Call to Compassion, Engendering Care and Respect for the Other in Our More Than Human World. So I begin with these two quotes. Let's see. Now I have to figure out how to move the, oh, here it is. I have to use the bottom of the page. So we start with a quote from Albert Schweitzer: "It is man's sympathy with all creatures that first makes him truly a man." And then the quote from Victor Hugo: "In the relations of man with the animals, with the flowers, with all of the objects of creation, there is a whole ethic scarcely seen as yet, but which will eventually break through into the light and be the corollary and the complement to human ethics." Looking through a pair of glasses. So in this webinar, I invite you to reflect on how our living experience of other sentient beings, which means each other, your pets, animals that you encounter in the woods, and even if you believe in plant sentience, which has been basically proven scientifically that plants are aware and can be aware, I highly recommend a book called The Secret Lives of Plants by Peter Tompkins. I had this book with me on a trip I took my students on to Costa Rica for an immersion experience. And once I started reading from it in the bus, everybody wanted to read that book. And so I ended up requiring it the next semester. But this is a book written by botanists who tell about the day that their life was changed when they realized that the plant sitting in front of them was reading their mind. And I'll just whet your appetite with that. So this idea of us having capacity to understand others, not just other humans, not just other genders, other races, other social groups among humans, but even other animals and other species, is part of what this whole talk is going to be about. So I invite you to reflect on how our living experience of other sentient beings becomes a call to action. If I step back, what I'm talking about here is the classic issue that comes up in ethics, in philosophy, is: do you go from ontology to ethics? From a description of what is, can you conclude or deduce what should be? We get into all of these intellectual gymnastics trying to decide, what comes first: metaphysics, ontology, ethics. But in the end, what I want to get at here is that it's our perceptual experience of other sentient beings that teaches us how to act, how to approach them, what to do. I'm going to rewind and give a quick example that several years ago, when I was on the APA, American Psych Association Council, I spent 2 years of my life writing a proposal with the help of a team of activists to get psychologists removed from Gitmo and from other black sites in the world where people were being tortured. And what kept me awake at night was my imagination of what these detainees were going through, what they were enduring in their solitary confinement with plastic handcuffs around their wrists, suspended from the ceiling all night long, sometimes dislocating their shoulders, being waterboarded by day, starved by night, blasted with 23 hours a day of ear-shattering Metallica, electric, heavy metal music, deafening the senses. And these people were crying to be freed from their state by going on a hunger strike. And a hunger strike is usually something you do to attract attention. They weren't trying to attract attention because they didn't believe anyone was even thinking about them. They just wanted to put an end to their misery. And so I wrote a proposal for the APA to change our ethics to make it impossible for a psychologist to participate in these torture situations, because the very presence of a psychologist in the torture interrogation, by definition, means that what is happening can't possibly be torture, because a psychologist is bound by ethics and in principle would not allow for it. So they basically get military psychologists to sit in a room while people are being tortured. And that's why George Bush was able to say to us, we did not torture anyone, because of the way they twisted the meaning of torture. So what I'm telling you here is that my action of spending a couple of years of my life writing a proposal that effectively did change the ethics, and at the end of that year, General Kelly removed all psychologists from all black sites and from Gitmo. So it was a triumph. It went through council 157-1. It was a very landslide victory in Toronto in 2015. What motivated me to work for 2 years to do this was my imagination of the hell that these people were going through. Not even my perception, but just my imagination of it. And my point is that whether it's a perceptual starting point or an imaginative one, it's in our living experience as human subjects that the call to action takes place once we become cognizant, whether through perception or imagination or memory, when we become cognizant of an unacceptable state of affairs that tells us something must be done. So I'm going to try to cut to the chase and give some examples along the way. More specifically, I'm questioning how it is that we move from simple everyday perception to action and advocacy, because this is a course on bioethics. Is this correct? We're studying bioethics. So how do we deal with ethics, which is a call to action? What should one do? What must one do when it comes to certain biological realities? I'm interested in understanding how perceiving and knowing others can move us into a position of caring and of caring for the other. Among the challenges for phenomenological psychology, and let me ask Susie, has the class been given some basics in phenomenology?
No.
Okay. So among the challenges, because phenomenology began over 100 years ago with what was called a transcendental perspective of the isolated, kind of a Cartesian starting point of the isolated cogito, the I think. And Husserl, building off of Cartesian's meditations, wanted to try to develop a philosophy that could connect the individual to others. So phenomenology began in the first person singular, in my experience, even before I look into your eyes sitting there on your computer screens, and try to feel who you are through the eyes and the facial expressions that I see. It begins with the I and it moves over toward the other. So among the challenges for this philosophy of phenomenology is how do we break from our first person singular experience in order to encounter and engage with others in a communal world? At the heart of today's lesson is the question of how our embodiment, with its aptitude for empathy, mutuality, and communality, how our embodiment enables us to transcend what philosophers call solipsism and simple self-absorption. Solipsism means to be isolated inside your own frame of reference, really not able to see anything from anybody else's point of view. And how do we transcend this and move toward moral, ethical, and practical engagement? So even before we engage in an ethics, there is the ethos, to use the Greek word, ethos, of the social world itself, which serves as a backdrop for all of my actions and all of my reflections. So the ethos is the social atmosphere. It's the social character of the world in which I live. Sometimes we call it the zeitgeist. What is the spirit of our times? We are living through very troubled times in America right now. The ethos is not a very unitary one. It's not unified the way it was in the 1950s when I was born, and in the early 60s, where there was it didn't matter which party you belonged to. Everyone kind of inhabited the same world and shared the same joys and sadness. It didn't matter whether you were a Republican or a Democrat. When Kennedy was shot, everybody wept. Everybody mourned his death. We did not politicize things like death. We did not politicize things like pandemics. We live in a different world today. The social ethos today is a very divisive one. So I'm trying to use the context of today to help you understand what this Greek word ethos means. Within the ethos of the social world, we encounter what the philosopher Emmanuel Levinas called the face of the other. The other's face for Levinas is an appeal. It's a call to action. He talks about the face of the other that calls me to respond. It was the face of the imagined detainee in his room alone at night, sometimes in a shallow grave, in a tiny box, nailed shut all night long, no food or water, no bathroom, no refrigerator, in the heat of the summer, stifling. It was in the face of that other that I felt called to do something. What can I do to change this person's situation? What I'll be presenting today as a second person perspective. So right now I'm talking to you, my audience, and I can see at least a couple of you on the side of my screen. The others who I address are the second person. You know, there's the first person is I, the second person you, who I speak to. And then if there was someone watching our conversation from the side, they would be the third persons. So this simple linguistic distinction between my first person experience, you is the person being addressed, and then there's always the audience out there, the third person. And if we reverse this, as psychologists, our interest is in the first person that we are studying, who is the child or the ape or the mental patient. It is their first person experience that we're trying to access. We try to access it through the words that they speak. We also try to access it through their gestures, through the look in their eyes, that sometimes is trying, if the stroke victim can't speak and they are begging for water, they may look at you with an intensity that you feel is calling to you. In that moment, when you feel called to by the other person, you have become the second person relative to them being the first person who's addressing you. Here's a really good example of this. Paul Watson, who is an animal activist, who has spent the last 30, 40 years of his life trying to stop the whaling industry from murdering, from killing all of the whales in the sea, and who rams his ship into these whaling vessels, mostly Norwegian and Japanese vessels throughout the planet that are going and engaging in illegal whale hunting. What motivated him to do this, to become an activist, is he was working on a whaling vessel. And while he was working on the whaling vessel as an employee, he saw them shooting harpoons into a pod of, I believe they were sperm whales, very large whales. And the male who saw his female killed in a bloodbath while they came after them with harpoons, swam fast and leaped out of the water up onto the ship itself as if to sink the ship, which of course it couldn't do. And as they bludgeoned it with harpoons, just stood there and stabbing this whale, Paul Watson was standing there, and he said he looked into the eye of this whale. And he said the whale's eye was looking directly at him, and it only expressed one thing: pity. The whale was looking at him, and the message that he felt was being addressed to him as the second person addressed by the whale was pity for him and his kind. Now, we can say that this was a very colorful elaboration, like someone writing a novel and imagining more than what was really there. Maybe the eye of the whale was just dying. But he says, with tears in his eyes, when you watch the documentary film, Watson is his last name, when he tells you this story, you will have tears in your eyes because your own empathy will kick in. As soon as you see the tears in his eyes, you will have them in your own. And you will understand immediately, even before you understand the sadness that he went through. The tears coming down your own cheek will announce to you what the meaning of his tears are, just as the tears coming down his cheek announced to him what the eye of the whale was communicating to him in the expression on the whale's face. So this is I know, a very dramatic example, but I want to get across what this idea is of second person perspectivity when we are engaged in an encounter with somebody else, and when we feel that we can know something about that person by virtue of the privileged perspective that we have because they're addressing us. And I'm going to later talk about when I go to the zoo and have a face-to-face encounter with a bonobo, where the bonobo walks up to me and looks me in the eye, addresses me as another subject. Or when I worked as an orderly, I started out as an orderly and then became a psychiatric technician in the VA hospital. And when the patient would look at me with a look of sadness in their eye, if they were a stroke victim, unable to speak, but I knew that they were trying to address me, trying to call out in me some action of caring for them. So I feel that there's this perspective that we have as the observers of others and even other entities, other species like whales and octopuses and bonobos. We have this perspective, a gifted perspective, when we are in a we relation with that other, like Paul Watson with the dying whale. He was in a we relation, and he was experiencing the other's intentionality within that we. So in principle, this would be the case in all dimensions of otherness: gender, race, species, and even possibly phylum and kingdom. Indeed, in the Oscar-winning documentary, My Octopus Teacher from 3 years ago, wildlife photographer Craig Foster takes us into his shared world with a cephalopod belonging to the mollusca phylum, an octopus, while Peter Wollenberger, and I just hold my book up here, Peter Wollenberger, in his groundbreaking book, The Hidden Life of Trees, What They Feel, How They Communicate, and in his more recent book, The Heartbeat of Trees, Embracing Our Ancient Bond with Forests and Nature. Together, those two books take us into his encounter with feeling beings from another kingdom altogether, not the animal kingdom, but the plant kingdom. Other feeling beings. We know now that trees communicate through their root systems. And in the recent Netflix documentary, Fantastic Fungi, how many of you have seen that? Do you all get Netflix and watch these things? These are all free. You will be forever transformed. My students loved this film, The Fantastic Fungi. Also, Paul Watson, and you can find other things like Seaspiracy on Netflix. My Octopus Teacher, I believe, is on Netflix. It's free to see. How many of you have seen My Octopus Teacher? Have you seen this? No? This film, more than any other that I'm going to mention today, will transform your life. I have students standing up in the back of the auditorium waiting to catch my eye, interesting, to address me from the back of the auditorium and to go like this to show me that they are so moved by the end of the film, they can't stop the tears from flowing. They're kind of happy, joyous, and sad all at the same time. It's only 80 minutes. Don't wait another week to see it. Once you watch it once, you will want to watch it 2 or 3 or 4. I've seen it like a dozen or more times. And I will send Susie the collaborative movie review that I wrote with my students that we just published. So Fantastic Fungi takes us into the world of yet another kingdom, fungi, to show us the multitude of ways that animal and plant life are all in ongoing communicative exchange with the Earth's fungi. So here we have, within my own situation, that of the other who I'm questioning makes its appearance. And in this bipolar phenomenon, I learned to know both myself and others. It's a beautiful passage from Merleau-Ponty, The Phenomenology of Perception. In this we relation, in this bipolar phenomenon, I learned to know both myself and others. And then there's the archetypal psychologist, James Hillman. So why not imagine that there's a correspondence between the joy that we are feeling and what the porpoise is feeling? Why not imagine that there's a correspondence between the sadness and the despair that the sperm whale is feeling in the moment of its dying and what I am feeling at the moment of observing its death? Who knows what goes on in the whale's soul, asks James Hillman. But why not read it through our own feeling? So again, I would say that's an example of the second person perspective, reading what's going on in the whale's soul through our own feeling, which is not a private event. My feeling in the face of the bonobo, the whale, the octopus, even the snail, the bird that nods its head. You know, you ever go around a bird in a pet store, and if you walk in and look at an African gray parrot and you start, you know, not just moving your head, but your shoulders with it, all of a sudden the bird's going like this and it's going from side to side on, you know, bobbing his head the whole time, and then the hair will stand up on his head. You can really communicate with all of the animals at the zoo. My niece goes into a zoo and sees the mountain goat exhibit, and she can make the most hilarious imitation of the sound of a male mountain goat. I can't do it, but you know, and all of a sudden this male mountain goat comes out of hiding and begins to make a sound back at her. Or you can hear a bird in your backyard and you're sitting there and you hear that a few times, and then you go, and it's amazing that you are able to make the exact same sound as the bird, just as a bird can make the exact same sound as you without ever trying, without ever testing the first time. You hear the sound, and all of a sudden, and I swear to God, those are the same pitches that I heard 10 years ago in my brother's backyard. And I got into a back and forth communication with this bird, and it was pretty hilarious. So my point is that we can engage other sentient beings as subjects with whom we are in a relationship. And the feelings, the imaginations, the images, the thoughts that pass through our mind in these moments of what Husserl called ineinander, in one another, in the in one anotherness of being in a situation with another living being, we come to know something about the other. And it's a privileged perspective because a third person watching us doesn't know what we're experiencing. I first learned this 20 years ago when I took a video that students took of me with the bonobos at the Fort Worth Zoo, and I showed it to my primatology professor at Bucknell, who was retiring. during the reunion weekend. And I went to his house and I said, Doug, you've got to see this. I had this amazing experience with this bonobo. Now, here's one of the world's foremost authorities on primatology watching this interaction between me and the bonobo. And he used to have no qualms about teasing me about being more of a philosopher than a psychologist. Here he was asking me, what do you think he's doing there? And I thought, wait a minute, why is Doug Canland, world authority on primates, asking stupid me what I think is happening? I'm showing him this because I want him, the expert, to tell me. And that's when I realized he implicitly understood that I had a privileged mode of access to what was happening in that encounter because I was a part of it. He wasn't. He was in the audience. But the bonobo and I were two actors on a stage. And what he was like, without realizing it, planting the seed in my mind as a psychologist, is that we've spent the whole last 100 years saying that psychology can either look at behavior from outside as a third person, looking objectively like a behaviorist, or we can be a psychoanalyst listening to the words of the interior of the patient and trying to access their first person perspective. But what about the second person? This whole realm within linguistics where we use the I and the you, the I and the thou. That's what Martin Buber was writing about. The I-thou relationship, which is the context out of which an ethics is born. If I look at you on the screen as it's, as things, as entities, as Homo sapiens, I don't feel called to speak to you or to try to enlighten you in some way. But when I look into your face and I see the smile breaking across it, it moves me to want to say more. It moves me to want to share something with you that might make your eyes open. So this idea of the privileged mode of access that we have as the second person being addressed by the animal, by the stroke victim, by the infant at the mother's breast, who has to learn how to read her infant's facial expressions. She knows the difference between a cry when hungry, crying when wanting to be held, crying when wanting to go to sleep. After a while, the mother understands that these are appeals to her to help, a call to action. So ethics grows out of our perceptual lived experience. But it's a perceptual lived experience not as robots, but as living beings who have the capacity to transcend our own perspective by attending to the other. Alfonso Lingus speaks directly to the current theme in his brief but compelling book, The Community of Those Who Have Nothing in Common. I'll return to that in a moment, as does David Abram in his book, The Spell of the Sensuous. I pulled these off my bookshelf. This is a wonderful book. I don't know if Susie knows David. I've met him on a few occasions. He lives in Arizona, I think, or Santa Fe area. But he wrote this wonderful book in 1996, The Spell of the Sensuous, Perception and Cognition in a More Than Human World. I think he may have been the one who coined that expression. And that was 96. And then this book is like 2015 or 16. An Italian woman named Maria Puig della Bellacasa. Maria Puig della Bellacasa. I don't know if you can see her name at the tippy top there. And she's got a image of a human hand with a plant. And the title of the book is Matters of Care. And you can see the I'm trying to do this right. You can see the subtitle there, Speculative Ethics in More Than Human Worlds. These are fascinating books to read because they are taking you into the world of nature and teaching you to listen to what nature is saying to you. And by the way, here's another film for you to watch, 2012, Aluna, A-L-U-N-A, Aluna. I had two students, female students in my class, come to me separately after this film, breaking into tears. One who was a German girl who had grown up in Nigeria, and the other was a Hispanic girl from South America, from Colombia. And the film is about the Kogi people, Kogi, the Kogi people who live in constant contact with nature and who went to the UN to give a message to their little brother. Their little brothers are us, the rest of the planet, who live down the mountain from where they live at the top of the universe. And they listened to Mother Earth, and they said, Mother Earth has a message. You are hurting her, and she's begging you to be kind to her. It sounds maybe to someone who's insensitive, like, oh, this is just, indigenous people have their funny beliefs. But today we pay more and more attention to indigenous people. And this is an example of an indigenous psychology and indigenous spirituality. The film is only 80 minutes, and you will, I think, be very moved if you watch it. So My Octopus Teacher and Aluna, to teach you the point of view, the world view of a culture other than your own. I have to, here we go. I'm losing my text here. All of these thinkers that I named and many others have advanced our understanding of the body as a mode of access to the meaning of human experience, whether our own or somebody else's. Each of them has prepared compelling descriptions of life world experiences to communicate to their readers in a palpable way how it is that we are not only connected to other sentient beings, but able to understand these other beings through a kind of communion with them. Alfonso Lingus has taken his lived understanding of Husserl's concept of coupling or pairing and intertwining into his encounters with others throughout his journeys around the globe. In his travels to India, which motivated all of his writings as a philosopher around 40 years ago. I had him come speak here at my university in 1982. He had never written any books yet. He had translated Levinas and Merleau-Ponty. And he told me that when he was in India, he spent time inside the hospices where the elders had been left by their families to spend their final days in solitary waiting, in many cases forlorn and abandoned. He sat with the dying, sometimes tending to them. And when he returned home to America, he was asked by his colleagues, why would you do such a thing? Why would you spend your time attending to those with whom you have nothing in common? Well, the irony of the question is captured in the title of his book, The Community of Those Who Have Nothing in Common. And of course, what is it that we all have in common? Our finitude, our death. Death individualizes us, but did it matter to Alfonso Lingus that he was sitting with someone from a different culture, a different belief system, a different skin color? It didn't matter at all. These people were dying, alone and forlorn, and he felt called to action. And what was the action that he took? He didn't try to heal them. He couldn't. He brought them water. If nothing else, the action that he was called to was quietly sitting with them, awaiting death with them, sharing in their being towards death. Very powerful message in this little book, The Community of Those Who Have Nothing in Common, when you think about how he must have felt about his colleagues in philosophy. Why would you do that? Why would you go to India and sit with those with whom you have nothing in common? So when our philosophy takes us into the realm of what we do have in common, then suddenly we feel called to listen. We feel called to observe. We feel called to understand. In his early lecture courses on Aristotle, Husserl's protege, Martin Heidegger, presented care as the meaning of human life. A few years later, in his opus magnum, Being and Time, Heidegger presented us with his care structure. in which our modes of involvement with each other, our very potentiality for being in this world, is grounded in our dwelling alongside entities and others encountered within the world. So even in this otherwise esoteric philosophy of existential phenomenology, we have this call to care for, by dwelling with, being with. That's exactly what Lingus was doing in the hospices of India. And then the French, Levinas and Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, you all, how many of the women sitting here have read Simone de Beauvoir, The Second Sex? That's, I'll tell you what, I had one of my Hispanic students wrote her final paper, The War That Was Lost. And the war was a war against me, a psychology professor who had the audacity to require 8 books. And she was a biology student who just read everything online and took multiple choice quizzes. And she was determined not to buy any of my books. And then she took the book out of the library. And when she had marked it up, which she shouldn't do, of course, but when she had marked it up to make it her own, she had to keep borrowing it back from her mother, who kept wanting to read it. And in the end, she had to buy a copy for herself and a copy for her mother. And then the story in her final paper went from book to book to book. She was not going to buy this book. She was not going to buy that book. And then she started reading it and saying, oh my gosh, even though these are old books printed in 1972 or 65, these are really, really good. I'm going to save these books for the rest of my life. So the war that was lost was her war against the professor who required them to buy these books. So The Second Sex is another one you should pay attention to, about the place of woman in social historical reality. So Levinas and Sartre always emphasized human responsibility and accountability to others. And this is at the backdrop of my understanding of bioethics and at the backdrop of my understanding of environmental ethics. The imperative is a book written by Lingus about Immanuel Kant's concept of the imperative. What must we do? And for the phenomenologist, for the eco-phenomenologist, we are called to action, called to care for the trees, the animals, the people in third worlds who cannot speak for themselves, who do not have a voice for themselves. Whether it's a child, an animal, a stroke victim, or a person from another culture on the other side of the planet, we feel called to advocate, which in Latin means voco, to vocalize, to speak, ad, toward, or for, to speak for the other.
We have a few minutes left.
How many?
5 minutes.
5 minutes. Oh my gosh, I've been going
some questions.
Huh? I'll take you through the slides at this point. Let's see. Let me get back to the screen share. I'm going to stop share and then come back. Here we go. Hello. Okay. Okay. This was my first encounter ever with the bonobo. After 10 minutes of him sitting there doing nothing, he suddenly walks up, and the first thing he does is announce himself. Here I am. Here I am. I just wanted you to see that. I have a beautiful description I'm going to read just a little bit of, and then I'll end. This is a description written by Bernd Jaeger, a phenomenologist from Ottawa, from Montreal, actually. Recently, I happened to walk past a little improvised children's zoo in the corner of a metropolitan shopping center. The zoo appeared at a popular attraction, and it was a delight to see the great interest with which young children observed the various animals enclosed within the circle. As I entertained myself by watching the children, a young girl of perhaps 4 years old drew my attention. The child looked with uncommon concentration at a white goat that, as if in response to the girl's curiosity, slowly walked over to where she stood and then stuck her head across the bales of straw in her direction. The animal appeared to be as curious of her as she was about it. It's hard to say what it was that so transfixed this girl in her attention upon this particular animal. Perhaps it was the extraordinary shiny whiteness of its coat, or the rosy white snout, or perhaps the tiny beard. The girl kept a distance from the straw, but now, with the animal so close to her, she ventured a further step, and then she hesitated for a few more moments before stretching out her arm and gingerly touching the neck of the animal. As she began to stroke, the goat stretched its neck, closed its eyes, and then stood completely still to receive the child's caress. It was at that moment that I saw the child's face break out in a very broad and triumphant smile. If we ask what made the child smile, we question at the same time what made her reach out to the animal and made her want to caress it. She was obviously too young to be gathering scientific data about a mammal, but she already understood how to enter into a dialogue with others and to form a bond with an attractive stranger. She did not approach the goat as a material object contained within a natural universe, but as a fellow creature inhabiting a common cosmic world. The broad smile announced that the goat had consented to be her neighbor. And from that moment, they would no longer fear each other or treat one another as complete strangers. She smiled because the animal had entered her world and because two separate and mutually indifferent domains had come together to form an inhabitable whole. This cosmos came into being at the very moment when the child reached out, touched the animal, and found it receptive to her touch. A threshold was established at the very spot where the child's hand touched the goat's neck, and at the very moment when the goat acknowledged the girl's presence and permitted her to enter her domain. So the key to the reversibilities of the flesh is realizing that it works in both directions at the same time. It becomes a condition of possibility for reciprocity in which we experience the true miracle of intersubjectivity. It's ultimately in this primal dimension of our embodied experience of others in our more than human world that calls us to compassion and invites us to reach out to other sentient beings to establish a threshold or a portal through which we can begin to engage in advocacy and stewardship on behalf of those with whom we share our common world. So that I will end it there just with a few images of my octopus teacher, where the octopus risking its own life to touch and caress. You know that the tentacles of the octopus contain half of its brain are in the tentacles. The tentacles are not only perceiving, tasting, but feeling and sensing the feeling of the other being and also communicating. So these tentacles that you are eating when you're having an octopus salad in a restaurant, you're eating the brain, the gray matter, the communicative organ, and the sensory organ of this amazing gift that we call the octopus, which in the final encounter with Craig Foster took the risk of attaching itself to his chest as he went up for a breath of air, trusting him not to cause harm. That was one of my moments with the bonobo, and I end with the bonobo kiss. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Scott. It was great to listen to your point of view from about empathy, bioethics, and this journey into the animal world. So I open the floor to questions. If any of you want to seize the opportunity. And I agree, these documentaries you brought up are really a must to watch. I think some of them I give in my class.
Yeah, please don't think of these as boring
No.
scientific, blah, blah, blah. You will be when I teach these courses, I bring the students out of the biology lab into the auditorium, turn all the lights out, turn the sound up, and put on a big screen these images. And I encourage them to sit close and just be enveloped by the immersive experience. So I really encourage you to see my octopus teacher, Aluna, Microcosmos from 1996. It took them 10 years to develop the cameras. You've all seen this type of stuff now on TV because everything is high definition, but 30 years ago, this was astonishing, the world of insects. Don't be shy. We have Emily Wen, Selena, Francesca. Who else is there? Maybe
Robert,
that's it.
Giulissa.
Yeah.
Ecco, Emily. How can I overcome my fear of speaking out on an issue? For example, your work on stopping, the work on stopping torture. Did you ever feel like, no. Did you ever feel like, what if no one listened to your work? That's a very good question, which I wanted to ask you in the previous conversation we had, and I didn't have a chance.
How do you overcome the fear that no one will listen?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you know what? I don't want to not to build this up like a biblical story, but I felt like David and Goliath, the story from the Bible of David who had to fight this giant. And he was a little guy and he had a slingshot and he ended up winning. But the point is, I was up against the entire military establishment. The Department of Defense, if they could have killed me, I think they would. I had people glaring at me, staring at me. These military psychologists were making it very clear. You talk about the second person perspective. They were sending me messages like, I got you. I wasn't afraid of not being listened to. I was being listened to and being heard, and they were livid because the result of what we did took away their strategic placement within the military. They didn't care about anything but their power, even at the expense. Anyway, the point is, how do you overcome the fear? You have to take little steps. And so the baby step that you take is when you're in a classroom, you give yourself the courage to raise your hand. Or when the teacher says, do you have any comments? Don't be shy about it. Sometimes the smartest student in the room is the one who's thinking all of these things. I know this because I make students write journals. Instead of giving quizzes and tests, I have them do a 400, 500 word journal each week based on the movie that I show, the readings that I assign, and their classroom experience. And what I've learned is that these students, and particularly the female students, especially the female students of color who come from cultures where it is not usually acceptable for females to be aggressive or to be assertive, they will share with me in their journals their innermost thoughts. And I think these are really smart students. I have to find a way of getting them to engage in class. And so sometimes I just call on them. And sometimes that's all it takes, by the way, as a lesson to the teachers, is the student may just be shy and waiting to be called on, and then they will discover their voice. I did this with one girl who, she responded and she said the most amazing things about these readings that we were doing in existential phenomenology. And then it made her feel empowered afterward to maybe do that again and maybe experience her voice. So what I would say is, I didn't just jump from being a quiet, which I was, a quiet introverted student in high school, to being an activist in Toronto at the APA convention with the media there and everything. It's little baby steps at a time where you learn that it's okay. You learn that it is safe to test the waters. In the previous podcast, I started with a story of my mother teaching me how to walk across a brook when I was 3 years old, to test the water, to test the stone before you step on it with all of your weight. go through the narrow passage to get to the easy other side, but she taught me in little steps how to be assertive, how to find my way, not to have to be taken across. She wanted to teach me how to find my way. So I would say to you to try to have courage. You know, that the word comes from the heart, core, right? The courage is a feeling in your heart to take a stand. And sometimes it's just being willing to say a few words in the classroom. You might be terrified. You might be sitting there thinking you're going to raise your hand. And I can remember this myself. My heart would be beating so fast, I thought that the person next to me could hear it beating. And I started to look to see if everyone could hear my heart beating. I had a schizophrenic patient who used to walk around with her hands in front of her face because she was sure that you could read her thoughts from the expressions on her face, which is not too much of a stretch, the second person perspective. So overcoming the fear is finding your heart. And when you find that your heart resonates with, for example, the Kogi people in the film Aluna, or the octopus in My Octopus Teacher, or the whale in the films of Paul Watson, or the chimpanzees in the films of Jane Goodall, please read Jane Goodall. Have you read her Book of Hope? I used that as my final reading. I just retired in the spring, and my final class reading was the Book of Hope. I get it for you.
There's also a wonderful documentary about her and her private life. It's very interesting.
What's that?
There's also a beautiful documentary about her and her private life, the relationship with her husband. She had to find some courage to be who she was.
Oh yeah, that film is called Jane, Jane,
Right.
Jane. It came out in 2017. What happened was that her husband, Hugo van Lawick, who has died, but he was one of the greatest of all nature photographers in the history of photography. Louis Leakey, who when she was 21 years old, sent her to the Gombe stream in Africa. He was playing matchmaker. So he sent this handsome young photographer from National Geographic to document her work. And of course, they fall in love with each other, and they married, and they had a child. And then his work took him elsewhere, and they couldn't give up their work for each other, but they still loved each other. But she had to have great courage. You know, I just wrote her a birthday message in early April for her 89th birthday, and she wrote back the same day. Her email address, I won't give the whole thing, but part of it is her nickname as a child was Mudface. She got the nickname Mudface because when she was a little girl, they had the police looking for her. She disappeared one afternoon, and they didn't know where she had gone. And they had everyone looking all over. Hours and hours went by, and she was so young. She was only like 6, maybe years old. And finally, in the evening, after dinner time, she shows up in the kitchen, and her mother says, "Wherever have you been? We have been worried sick about you." And she says, "Well, I wanted to know how a hen lays an egg. And so I went and I hid in the hen house, and I waited. And now I know." So it took her the courage to skip dinner, to stay in the hen house. And she came back looking like a ragamuffin with her hair with feathers and dirt and everything on her face. But she had the courage to do that. And she had the courage to go to Gombe and sit at the top of the hill every day for 6 months. And then she had the courage to go into the forest and risk her life because they could have torn her apart. And of course, they knew she was there. They could smell her. But as long as she felt that she was hidden behind the bushes and in the branches, as long as she didn't visibly appear, everything was okay. And then finally, one day, the adult male, David Greybeard, reached out. Actually, what he did was he let her groom him. He presented to her his back, and she put her fingers through his hair. And she said that was the proudest moment of her entire life, was the day that David Greybeard let her groom him. Anyway, courage.
Courage.
And practice, Emily. practice. You know, to do anything in life, you have to practice. If you're going to be an athlete, if you're going to be a student, you have to practice reading, you have to practice playing tennis, you have to practice running. So you have to practice speaking. To practice speaking, do it in little situations. Do it. Do you have roommates? You know, no. Do you have some friends that you hang out with at lunchtime or go to dinners with, like on college campus? So, you know, you start there. I started learning to speak and take a stand when I was in 7th or 8th grade, sitting at the lunch table at school, being dorky like all the guys, you know. But I mean, we would sit there, you know, too afraid to talk to the girls. But we learned to discover our own voice among ourselves. And then finally, you know, one of us, maybe it was me, I don't know, took the courage to go talk to one of the girls at the but you have to find it in your heart.
Seems impossible to me, Scott, to imagine you as a shy young boy. But apparently, that happened too.
What happened?
A moment in your life in which you were shy
Yeah.
and
Oh
afraid to
yeah.
speak.
I was painfully shy. Look, I was the youngest in my class and the smallest and the shortest. You had to turn 5 by November 30th to go to kindergarten, and I turned 5 on November 29th. So I was the youngest in my whole class. In 6th grade, I was in the smartest class, but the teacher wanted to hold me back because he said it's going to hurt you through high. We told my parents he's going to have a hard time in high school because everybody else is going to be growing faster, and the guys are going to look more like guys, and he's going to still look like some little kid, which was true. So I just was I was shy as a result of that. I was in a gym class of 90 people. I was number 3 in terms of the shortest one at the bottom of the bottom of the male pecking order. So when you feel that you're at the bottom, you have to discover ways of compensating. And I would do it with humor. I would do it by mocking the big guys. And then they would chase me, but I could outrun them.
The same strategy always. Anyway, thank you so much for being here and this wonderful talk. We have to close now. But yeah, thanks for the window you gave us to this topic today. And thanks for the people who attended.
Yeah, thank you, Emily, Selena. And if there's anyone else there I don't see, is there? Yeah, I got the gallery. Yeah. Okay. I see you, Susie. That's a pleasure always to speak with you.
Me too.